overall, we are seeing a steady increase in the average. Now, that doesn't mean we're not seeing what we're seeing. That doesn't mean retail chains are not offering those really, really low salaries. It means that there's a significant shift going on in our profession.
All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the Happy PharmD podcast. Today, I have again with me Mr. Alex Barker. Welcome again, Alex, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And today is going to be a very interesting episode. We're going to go into some data, the 2021 Pharmacist Salary Guide, and we're going to kind of take a deep dive into that, talk about all the metrics and graphs that we see here for all of y'all, and just kind of talk about what we've seen for the past year with pharmacists. So Alex, I'll have you jump right in.
We've been doing the salary guide now this is our 7th year looking at it. And I would say in the past, we kind of took a all approach. Anything that we could find about salary data, we threw it in. This time, it's the most concise. It is the most organized. And frankly, I think it's the best report we've put together. I know this because we've put the most work into it. So with that, we'll put links to the guide. What you can do on the page as well is actually know your worth. You can get an estimate based on your salary, how it compares to the average across the 7 resources that we gathered on pharmacist salary data. So I'll reveal a little bit of a secret. The average salary ranged just about 125 across the 7 resources, which it's been about 120, 125 reported by multiple resources for the last 4 years. Our salary hasn't really changed, which is not what the doomsday sayers, I think, kind of claim. We talk to a lot of people. We help a lot of people get transition jobs. So we actually know very often what they're being offered, the exact amount, because we help with salary negotiations. And I would say with the clients I've worked with, it's all over the place, right? It'd be hard for me to just say, based on the people I've worked with, it's this average. Would you say the same thing, Chris?
No, I agree. It's especially with everything changing, but and as time goes on, it's a broad range. It's not specific. It can vary quite a bit, and also depending on what you're going into, what field, it can vary quite a bit.
So it does range between all the resources. At the very lowest, we have seen 83,000 was the lowest reported by PayScale. And the highest was reported by JobRx and Mercer salary report of $157,000 per year. And to me, this just goes to show how versatile I think the pharmacy profession remains. There are jobs out there where you can be paid upwards 150, 200, and in some cases, very rare, $250,000 per year. We're talking executive level, C-suite. We're talking dean of colleges. We're talking pharma companies. So that's great. But on the flip side of that, everyone has heard the reports of what new grads and some pharmacists are being offered by specifically retail chain pharmacies. We're talking, $35, $45 per hour. Have you heard those reports as well, Chris?
I have, and it scares me, right? Especially with the, you're saying new grads, right? The cost of school has not gone down by any means, over the years. If anything, it's doubled, over the last 10 years. So the fact that the pay is almost cut in half, right, and the hours are decreasing, it's kind of scary, to be honest.
Yeah, and you're actually right. I actually don't know exactly the average debt 10 years ago, but I know, according to our good friend at Your Financial Pharmacist, Timothy Olbrich, reported that last year's 2020 grads, the average was 165. He may correct me, it's 175, but regardless, that is the price of a cheaper home in the suburbs somewhere. It's an insane investment.
Yeah, no, and I feel like, and a big part of that is also, like you said, with the average salary. And I think, a lot of times they'll say, with debt, you want to try and you look at it as in terms of how much do you make a year and how much do you coming out of. And when you're,
Hmm.
your annual income, and that's gross, not not net, it's still not, it's more than double, right? For a lot of people, especially if you're talking about the 35 to 40 an hour. It's well over double of your income. So it's pretty scary to
Yes.
see, and it just seems to be going up. And that average, I'm not sure if that includes private too. I mean, if you think about a private school, it could be well over 200, 300, right? It's
Ugh.
just astronomical numbers. So
Yeah,
and
it's
then you're
early in the morning and I'm already sweating just thinking about it.
and then you just kind of bring up the decrease in hourly salary. It's wow, it's mind blowing.
So there's three guides or I'm sorry, three resources that we looked at, compare year to year data: salary.com, payscale.com, and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they reported that their average has increased from the prior year. This is, I think, important to point out that overall, we are seeing a steady increase in the average. Now, that doesn't mean we're not seeing what we're seeing. That doesn't mean retail chains are not offering those really, really low salaries. It means that there's a significant shift going on in our profession. It means there's a shift to, well, actually, you know what? We'll save that. We'll save what's happening in the job market, because
Okay.
in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about why you need to know what's going on in the job market and what's going on. So more information about that later. Sorry, I was about to do spoiler alert. So we are seeing increases. And in fact, glassdoor.com, it's in this blog as well, shows an excellent graph that displays the cumulative pay growth over time. And in the last few months, we have seen a slight decrease. We're talking like 2%. But we also take it with a grain of salt, because Glassdoor has about 10,000 self-reported pharmacist salaries, which obviously comes with quite a bit of bias and people potentially manipulating data. So you just have to be a little careful when looking at it. But overall, we are seeing an increase in our salary, which is good. It's not all doom and gloom. That is a slightly good thing, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's kind of like what you're saying in terms of with jobs in pharmacy, like you're kind of seeing that shift to people possibly being more entrepreneurial, changing the way of pharmacy that you may have looked at it 5 to 10 years ago. And I think, yes, you're looking at a lot of people might be, laser focused on that, the retail number, how that's going down. And of course, a lot of people, even coming out of college, are kind of considering going into retail.
Mm,
So it's more of like the first thing that kind of pops up, hospital retail. But I think, like you're saying, you're still seeing that growth, because I think a lot of people are kind of, going off the normal path. They're kind of starting new ways of pharmacy that we maybe 5-10 years ago wouldn't have thought possible or even existed.
very much so. I think we'll talk about that in the job shifts,
Yeah.
how the market's changing in just the last 3 months. But spoiler alert, you're right. We are seeing a lot more non-traditional stuff come up. We're seeing people willing to take a risk, and it's because of how bad things are in some situations. People are coming to terms with the fact that, hey, I'm making all this money, but I'm miserable. Something has to change. So the next section in our salary guide looks at based on experience. And I think this is really telling, and this is something that should be taught to young people with like some caveats, because when you talk about 30 years of experience, you're talking to someone who's not even 30 years old. Because when you look at Pharmacist Salary Guide, the youngest, the people with less than 1 year experience, their annual wage is $113,000, which to a young kid who maybe has never had a job, has only been in school his entire life, maybe an internship here and there, that's an insane amount of money for a young guy or gal. That is a ton of money. However, if you were to add 20 years of experience, 20 years of making mistakes, of learning, leading, hiring, firing, managing inventory, saving thousands of lives because of their service, you would add, according to payscale.com, less than $12,000 a year
Wow.
$12,000 a year. That's roughly about $6 an hour extra.
And I just want to like put an emphasis on that. You said over 20 years of experience, correct? Someone from out of
Over
school
20.
versus 20 years of experience.
You're worth $6 more, or roughly about, somewhere around 7-8%. My math is horrible, so don't quote me on that. I
We'll
can
have to
see it in
fact
like
check
Drug Times.
that.
That's the quote that someone gets me in a news article. He doesn't even know how to do math. You're right, not quickly. So we're talking such a small percentage of value. We have in many traditional settings, hospital, clinical, retail, the ceiling was always low. I remember working at a clinical institution, and I remember learning about the grade scale, where you got paid based on the amount of grade that you got, and basically whether you were performing really well or you weren't performing well at all, there was a timed response based on when you got a significant pay raise. And we're talking a few $1,000s, to the point where my salary grew from, I think it was like 115 in the beginning to 129 near the end over a 5-year period of time. And my performance was, I would say, relatively no different than my colleagues. That is so sad. It's great. It's a lot of money, but it ultimately means that our performance doesn't equate to monetary value, which in turn is related to why we have such high burnout rates. Because when we have a lack of autonomy, when we feel like we have a lack of control in what we do and a lack of reward based on what we can control, it feels like we're just kind of doing nothing. We're not making a difference in people's lives. So this glass ceiling that we have in terms of salary is halting innovation. It's halting progress. It's halting people to even just want to perform well. Because, $12,000, don't get me wrong, is a lot of money. But for myself and being a young kid, $12,000 more wouldn't necessarily motivate me to work my butt off, to try as hard as I could to do a great and amazing job to make that much more money. But anyways, we're kind of bringing up the question of like, does a hardworking pharmacist who saves more lives worth more than one who doesn't? And that's kind of like a moral and ethical issue. Let's just focus on data. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, and I kind of want to ask, so in terms of, when you said you've had about 5 years of data, is that correct? You've been doing this for about 5 years?
Seven
Okay.
years.
So
Yeah.
looking back, if you can, I'm just curious, have you seen, what is the biggest change you've seen looking back? Like in terms of, like regarding the ceiling, has it gotten even lower? The growth wise from beginning to end? Do you have any? I'm just curious, because since you've been looking at it over the last 7 years, roughly, it'd be interesting to see if that's gone down. The ceiling's become shorter, or not.
So if you look at our first ever guide in 2015, which looked at 2014 data, you can see that the average salary was 119,000. So 7 years ago, that is a fairly significant difference, but not much.
Yeah.
Not much. Is it enough to like be ranked against inflation? Maybe it's even. We know for a fact everything's getting more expensive and will continue to do so. What I do find interesting is we talked about the average debt load just now based on 2020 data. 2014 data, the average debt was
Oh my goodness.
$114,000.
Wow.
114. So we're going into a crisis. We'll be talking a little bit about what's going on in terms of number of graduates and number of applicants as well, as to what's going on there in a future episode about the job market. But yeah, crazy stuff.
That is
I would say that's the
that is
biggest.
so interesting if you look at that. Wow. Okay, but yes, so let's jump right back into to this year's data again. I was just curious about that comparison. So yes, let's go right back into it. So what was the next part that the results showed?
So the next part we looked at was based on the job sector. And we tried to do our best with this data. But what we find over and over again is that no one can really agree to define how a pharmacist, what they work in. If you look at physicians, their practices, their specialties, they've been set for years. And it isn't hard to look at a doctor's salary guide and understand, okay, radiologists make this much, a general surgeon makes this much. In pharmacy, we have 4 to 5 different names for the same kind of job, and yet some include others while others don't. So, for example, for whatever reason, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a U.S. organization, defines us in part to work at food and beverage stores. I don't know what that means, because there's also general merchandise stores, which I would think is like a Walmart, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm
And then
thinking
there's
maybe like
also,
grocery stores. Maybe is that where they're getting food and beverage?
well, there's also pharmacies and drugstores.
Oh,
So food and beverage, maybe it's just grocery, but man, it's difficult to say the least. But what we showed here is a wide range of different answers for different kinds of jobs. The highest that we saw, according to JobRx, was 157,000 for nuclear pharmacists, and the lowest salary we found was for a registered staff pharmacist in a chain drugstore, according to Glassdoor, at $106,000. So again, we are ranging all over the place, and also recognize, like I just said previously, the lowest salary we saw was 83,000, according to PayScale, but they didn't report like where that pharmacist worked on payscale.com. So reporting is all over the place, but it shows trends. If you're a specialist, you're going to be paid more, just hands down. If you're a manager, you're going to be paid more. If you are on the front lines, if you are I would say a regular pharmacist, which is still a great job, you should expect your salary to be less than not. So nothing really new here. There's not a whole lot of change in this data, interestingly, but overall we're seeing, retails positions, outpatient pharmacies continue to be higher paid according to multiple sources. So it ranges all over the place. And I know that many people hold the horror stories that are being told in online groups about, the $35 an hour stories versus the hard data of what people are reporting. So I think it's wise to take some of these stories with just a grain of salt, just a little bit
no,
at
I
a
think
time.
it's very interesting. Like that, like making that point where these stories are coming out, but then the data is still supporting that. In fact, kind of pretty much the opposite, right? That there still are one of the higher paid compared to the large overall scope of pharmacy. But no, that's interesting. But I think we've all heard. I'm sure people listening right now have all heard those stories, which I'm sure there is possibly some truth to that as well. But it's hard to say, right? But it's very interesting. Very interesting.
So the last thing to talk about, and we kind of hinted at it earlier, but just to wrap this up, is salary changes. So Drug Channels has reported a mild increase. We're talking 2.1%, in hospital settings and retail settings, 1.2%. Drug Topics reported a decrease. So that the ranges between 100 and 130,000 was down 38% in 2020 compared to 40% in 2019. So just a very small decrease. We also put in an image from Glassdoor. You can see this kind of ranging variability here, going up and down over time, but mainly going up since about 2015, and seeing not much change really is what's happening. And then the final thing to note that I think is confirming the $35 an hour myth or horror story, whatever you want to call it, because they reported about 13% of pharmacists, according to their report, had less than $70,000 a year as a part of their salary. And unfortunately, we don't know the percentage of that 13%, whether they were full-time or part-time, but we do know that 78% of the full report worked full-time and only 13% worked part-time. You could reason that there's probably more part-timers under that bracket, but I think we can also venture a guess that some of them were full-time. So overall, we're seeing kind of staying the same, some up, some down, not a lot of change. we are continuing to be a six-figure starting salary position, and we are seeing new grads start at high five figures. But of course, there's the potential for them to get to that six-figure mark still, but that ceiling remains very low for our salary.
Yeah, and I guess the big thing there, as we're wrapping up to the end here, I feel like overall, it's does this find or do you find people being more discouraged as they see this data, or do you think it's more an opportunity to try and find a new way to grow? And I know we're going to get more into the job market later on next month, or in April. But are your thoughts here that people are getting more discouraged in getting into pharmacy just because of seeing this data?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is just a part of it. I think the main reason why people are not pursuing pharmacy is the online reports of not being able to find a job. That's the main thing. I think students are more intelligently looking at the cost of tuition and education versus the return on investment. And we're mentioning them again, but Timothy Ulbrich and I believe a few other colleagues did a very in-depth economic analysis of the debt load versus the salary and the return on investment. I don't remember the exact conclusion, but I remember walking away from the article thinking, yeah, we just barely meet the mark. We just barely overcome the cost of that.
Wow.
And so I think you can make tons of predictions about what's going to happen, and that's probably more for the job market report. But I do think we eventually will see the pendulum swing back. Markets always change. Now seems like forever. 20 years ago, it was a very opposite situation. And I think time will tell what will happen. But it's very clear we have an oversurplus. And whenever something is in high surplus, the price of it goes down always. Well, practically always. I'm not an economics professional, but we know why it's decreasing. So yes, I would say there's definitely a less interest in the pharmacy profession because of what's going on really as a whole in our profession, sadly.
No, understandable. And I feel like, as we wrap up here, overall, though, I kind of, like you said, you kind of alluded to, in the past, there used to be a huge demand for pharmacists, right? And now it's kind of the complete opposite. So I'm curious to see if time will tell, if there's going to be less pharmacy schools or just less pharmacies coming into the market. And we'll see this kind of flip around. Of course, again, we're no economic expert here, but I'm curious to see if something, down the road, you could very well see the opposite kind of have it switch gears completely again. So it'll be interesting to see.
Time will tell. Maybe we'll tease out what's going to happen in our next podcast episode about the job market. We'll talk about this more in our next episode on April 15th about what's going on in the job market. But in part, what's happening is there's actually mandates from an association or two that pharmacy schools need to decrease the amount of students they accept. And so we're going to see some changes. We're going to see some schools close probably. So if you want to get a snapshot of what we talked about, if you want to go over it in more detail, if you go to our website, we'll put the link in the show notes. We actually have a full report that you can download and read it later. And we dive into more topics like pharmacy stress, how things are changing there, job satisfaction, and most importantly, job growth. Where are the opportunities? So I think you'll enjoy it. It is a very long document, so it's worth downloading, getting your hands on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Alex, so much for joining us again to talk about all this. It's a very important topic going on right now. And again, everyone listening, please check out that link and also send any questions our way. We'd love to help you guys out any way we can. Thank you again so much for being on, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much again for joining us today on this episode of the Happy PharmD podcast. Again, please check out the comment section below to check out the link directly to get you to the 2021 Pharmacist Salary Guide to be able to see all the specific data that we discussed today in further detail, all the data and charts and analysis that was put in, and to see if there is anything else that also is of interest to you there. There's plenty of information, tons of data, as Alex said, to see all the changes and everything that's going on with the pharmacy profession. And again, please join us later this month in April to discuss the job shift and analysis that we are seeing in all the career paths in pharmacy and what exactly is going on overall regarding jobs and pharmacy schools and everything in between. So really excited to talk more about that and hear all the details with Alex on that. And again, thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.